Dave Scotland here for cgswot.com, and today's tutorial we're going to have a look at the Trapcode Particular plugin, and we'll be using the Particular plugin to generate these missile trails, and we'll also be using Particular to generate the clouds, the 3D clouds that you see the missiles flying through. And we'll also use another Trapcode plugin called Horizon, which allows you to map an image onto a spherical scenario so that the camera, as it moves around, the image reacts in a very natural way. So this is the end effect that we're going for. Now we'll be using a lot of random generated movement, so don't be surprised if the effect isn't absolutely identical, but we'll try to get it as close as possible. We'll get started. I'll just close that down. Now the first thing we need to do is create a new composition. So if we click Composition, New Composition, we'll call this one Master Comp, and we'll make it 720 by 488, 25 frames per second, 250 frames long, or 10 seconds. We'll click OK to that. We'll get our smoke element out of the road to start with. So if you click on the smoke element in the project panel and drag it down onto Master Comp, and with it selected, we're going to pre-comp it by clicking Layer, Pre-Compose. We'll call this Smoke, and we will open the new composition and leave all attributes in the master composition. So just click OK to that. That's created our new smoke composition at 377 by 329. Now at the moment there's no transparency, so we're going to create that transparency by creating a new solid. So if we go Layer, New, Solid, and we'll make it a white color, and make comp size, click OK. We'll just drag that down underneath the smoke, and we'll open up our track matting, and we're going to use the Luma mat. And if I click on transparency now, you'll see that our smoke is there but our background is not, and it just works on the luminosity value of our original image. So that's fine, and our smoke's ready to go and set up. It's also important to make sure that the length of this smoke comp is also 10 seconds long, otherwise our particles will disappear at the point that the comp finishes for smoke. Okay, so back in our, we'll just hide that smoke element, and we'll create our background element. So if we drag down a new, or create a new solid, and we'll name this one BG, and make comp size, click OK. We'll drag it down, well actually it's fine there, and we'll bring up our effects control panel. Actually before we do that, let's drag our sky JPEG down, and just to give you a quick look at that, it's a spherical map that I generated in Bryce 3D, just a quick easy way to do spherical mapped sky elements, cheap and nasty, and we'll hide that as well. And so we have our background solid here. In our effects control, we'll right click, Trapcode Horizon, and the image map toggle is what we want, and we'll click the drop down and click Sky Dark. Now at the moment we're not seeing anything there, and that's quite okay. What we need to do is just adjust some settings here. For the H coverage, we're going to type in 121, and for the V coverage we'll type in 48. And That's probably going to be fine for what we need. Orientation, we might just straighten the orientation, and that just takes a bit of the curve out of it. And maybe rotate it on the Y slightly to about 20, and that should be fine. We won't really know how it will look until we get our camera created, so we'll go ahead and do that. We'll create a layer, new camera. 35mm is fine, and we'll click OK. And we also need to create a null object, so create layer, new null object, and we'll rename this null object by hitting enter to master null. Click OK. Now we'll turn the master null object into a 3D layer, and you'll see if I move the camera about, that background element is wrapped around, and that's the Horizon plugin that's doing that. So first thing we need to do, if I just switch to a top view so you can see what's happening, our camera is selected there, and our null object, if I select it, is in the center here. So what we're going to do is parent our camera to the null object. So if we bring up our parenting column and drag the parent pick whip to the null object, and that way if we move our null object, the camera moves with it. We'll go back to our camera 1 or active camera, and we're going to type in some position values. Hit P to bring up position. At frame 0 we're going to click the stopwatch and type in -2000, and at frame 250 we're going to type in 2000. And if we just go to a top view to have a look at what that's done, we've got this animation moving forward. So that's fairly simple. We'll go back to our camera view, and the next thing we need to do is create our clouds. So if we create a new solid object, solid, we'll call this clouds, make it any color. We'll go for a pinky sort of hue, make comp size, and click OK. We're going to drag that down just above our background, and we're going to right click on our effects panel to bring up Trapcode Particular. And at the moment you won't see anything there, and if we scrub through you'll see that the particles are being created and the camera is actually flying through them. So what we need to do is play with some settings here to get our clouds. And the first setting we need to have a look at is the emitter, and we're going to crank that up to 2000. We're going to change the emitter type to box, and while we're looking at the emitter type we'll change the emitter size. On the x-axis we're going to type in 10,000, which is pretty large. On the y, 3000, and on the z, 4000. Now the velocity settings, we're going to take the velocity random out, 0, velocity from motion to 0, and the velocity will crank up to about 5,500. We don't have any rotation, direction uniform is fine, and everything else is fine for now. And what we're going to do you'll see that I'll just hide that background. You'll see that our particles are quite large. I'm going to change our particle type. So let's bring up particles, and in the particle type we're going to select custom colorize, and in the custom pull down we're going to select our smoke element. So in layer, smoke. Now if we come through, we'll see that our little dots are smoke, but they're actually quite small, so we need to play with the size. Now the size for these are quite large, and we'll crank that up to 1000, and it's covered. You'll see that in those first couple of frames we're starting to get that cloud effect that we're looking for, but we're also getting way too many clouds, but we'll be fixing that. And the next thing we need to do is play with the physics, and this is how we get the clouds to stay in a stationary position. The effect we're looking for here is the physics time factor, and at frame 0, if we click on the stopwatch to create a keyframe, then we're going to come through about 4 or 5 frames. About 4 frames is fine. Or sorry, 2 frames. We'll come through to frame 2, and then we're going to wind this down to 0. And then what you'll see is our clouds are now stationary. And you'll also notice that there are no clouds at frame 0, but what you need to be aware of is that the effect has to have some time to build. So we won't actually be using the first 10 frames of this animation. So if you come through to frame 10 and just drag your work area, any rendering we do is going to come from 10 frames and beyond. Those first 10 frames are for creating the actual effect. Now what we can do is go back up to the emitter now that we've created it, and just move the emitter in the Z, just so that we can drag it back. About there's fine, so that early on we're on the edge of it, and as we go through we're moving through it, and it's starting to look pretty good. Probably the only thing we need to do now for the clouds is to give them a bit of colour. So we're just going to bring up our background. They're a little bit white, and white is not a colour you find very often in nature, so we're going to give it a sort of a dull pink, something like that. There's really not much colour in it, but just enough to indicate that there are some bounce light coming from the sun and various other elements. And that looks pretty good. We could probably increase the number of particles here to maybe 2200, and just come down into the particle settings here, and there's a couple of things we need to change. First of all, it's set to 3 seconds, and we don't want our particles to start popping off in the middle of the animation, so to be sure we'll just set that up to 10 seconds. Life random is fine at 0. We'll give it a little rotation, probably 50%, and size random, we're going to crank that up to about 60%. We'll just check that through again. Seems to be working fine. Yep, and that should be it. Opacity, we're going to turn the opacity down just slightly to make these clouds a little bit see-through, and we'll probably bring that down to about 35. Let's make it 45, maybe a little bit more. There we go, 65. Opacity random, we'll crank that up a little bit, maybe 50, and that just gives it a little bit more depth. Some of those clouds are a little bit more see-through than others, and that's fine. That's what we're going for. So that's our cloud elements. They look fine. There's probably one more thing we can do quickly, just to make sure that any clouds that come close to the camera don't pop off. We want them to fade off as they come close to the camera. So if we go into our visibility settings, our near start and near vanish, we're going to change those. The near start value we're going to make, let's make it about 500, and the near vanish about 50. And that way, when any clouds come close to the camera, they'll fade off rather than pop off, and you can see there's a bit of a fade off happening there. So that's fine. That's working fine, and now we can move on to our trails. So if we bring up our new solid, and we're going to name this Trails 1, and we'll just make it black. Color's not important. We're going to drag that down on top of the clouds, and in our effects we're going to right click, Trapcode Particular. And if I just isolate that, you'll see that our, same as before, our particles are creating and the camera's moving through them. So what we need to do with this first is just go into the particular settings, and we're going to pre-run of 100%. And what that means is that we're going to get particles happening a little earlier in the piece. And the first thing we need to do is wire our emitter position to our master null. So if we bring up our emitter position, and down in our layers we'll also do the same, bring up our emitter and position. You'll see here we have a X and Y position. We also have a Z position. The one we're going to wire is the Z position, which is in and out relative to camera. So if we bring up the null object, and it has a Z position over here of at frame 0 it's 2000. So what we're going to do is alt click on Z position to bring up our pick whip. We're going to drag our pick whip up to Z position, and now our particles are moving with that object, with that null object. So we'll just bring a little bit of velocity down to about 2 on the particles, and velocity random down to about 5%, and velocity from motion 0. And it's a bit hard to see at the moment because the camera's flying straight at it, but there's another expression we're going to type into this. So we've got our trails particle XY position. We're going to alt click, and we're going to type in wiggle bracket 0.5, I'll make it 0.4 comma 150, close bracket. And we've made a mistake there somewhere. Take the R out, and it's 0.4, and now you'll see that our XY position is allowing the emitter position to move around away from that null object, and we're starting to get some nice missile movement, and that's looking pretty good. Now if we slide down to our, just bring this up, keep this a little tidier. We slide our missile trails down to particle. We're also going to use the smoke element. So for particle type, we're going to go custom colorize, and in the custom pull down we'll select smoke, also going to increase the number of particles to 1,000, and let's increase the velocity to about 22. Oop, too much. Bring it back to say 10. And that's fine. And we need the life of the particle to be about 5. Life random, we can adjust that up to about 30%. And rotation is fine. Rotation speed, we'll give it 0.5 on the rotation speed. That just gives it a little bit of rotated randomness. Size, we want the size up to, let's say 27, which makes it quite large, but we're going to use size over life, and we're just going to draw a little bit of a graph here, something like that. 27 could be a bit big. Let's bring it down from 27 to about 15. Size random to about 35. And maybe bring the size down again to about 8. It's probably a bit small. 12. That's fine. Now I think what's happening is we're a little bit far away from the actual effect, and we need to bring the emitter a little closer. Now we can do that by selecting our trails, hitting U for our animated tracks, and at the end of the Z position we're going to type in plus 150. What that's going to do is just bring it a little closer to us. We can probably double that to 300, and that's working a lot better. And probably decrease our velocity a little bit. Bring that down to about 6, and that's working much better. We're starting to get what we're looking for. Now let's have a look at some color. We'll go down into our particle settings there and take a look at set color over life. So if we look at set color, change that to over life. It's green at the moment, but mainly that's because of this color over life setting is on this rainbow effect. So let's just swap it to a white and black and move the white slider out a little bit. Come to somewhere where we can see our effect a bit better. And just before the white we're going to click to create a new swatch, double click to bring up our color, and we're just going to give it a slightly yellowy red hue, something like that. And if I drag this out, you'll see that that color can come all the way through. What we want is the white to start fairly soon after the yellow. And then we go into a much darker grey, and if we just bring up this black and bring it into a dark grey, select OK. We'll just bring up our background for now so we can see how it's reading on that, and as you can see that's starting to look pretty good. Now these first 50 frames we're probably not going to be able to use them. We'll probably start our total animation out at about frame 61. So we'll just slide that up. And we can always extend beyond later on, but I think for now it's fine. And the size is a little bit of a concern, so we'll just play with the size here. We'll bring the size up to about 20. And I think what we could do also, we do have some points where the effect is coming fairly close to camera, like this here. It's coming through the camera, so we'll use our visibility settings again. We'll have the near vanish out at about 100 and the near start fade out at about 250. Actually bring the near vanish back to about 20. And that's going to work fine. Probably bring the near start fade down to about 100 and the vanish down to 10. But feel free to play with those settings to sort of get the effect that you're looking for. I think we're starting to look okay with that. Probably one more in the particle settings. We'll change our transfer mode. Let's change our transfer mode for color over life to normal add over life. And if I just slide this through, I'll probably bring the size of our size over life is a little bit small to start with. We need it to be a bit bigger. That's sort of getting close to where we need. And you can click on the smooth button to sort of smooth that graph out. Okay, we're starting to look pretty good. And what that add over life is basically, if we draw a bit of a graph here, actually the other direction, draw it up here like this, you'll see that it's added where it's thickest at the top here. It's the maximum amount of add, so the white is using an add layer mode, and so we basically will just reset that, and the one we need is high at the start and then ramping down. And if you see, as we come through a little bit more, it's much brighter at the start here, and then it moves back down the trail to less add. So that's looking pretty good. Probably now that we've done that, we'll just make a minor adjustment to the color. Come into the color over life, and we'll just bring a little bit more color into that, and a little bit of red. Something like that. Bring the white up, and you'll see that that's starting to give us the effect we're looking for. Okay, so we're looking pretty good there, and all we need to do now is do some adjustments. First thing we're going to do is go into our camera position settings, and we'll just bring up P for on the camera, and the position we're going to alt click, and we're going to put a slight wiggle of, say, let's say 0.3, 200. And you'll see straight away that what that's done is given the camera some, come through again, it's given the camera some sort of random movement around. 200 might be a bit large, so let's bring that down to 150. And we'll also have a look at the camera point of interest, and we're going to just type a very slight wiggle into that point of interest. So Alt click, wiggle, and we'll type 1,10, and that just gives a little bit of camera movement and a little bit of point of interest movement. And when we do a RAM preview shortly, you'll see where I'm coming from with that. So let's just bring up our clouds again, and let's do a RAM preview. Okay, we're back from that RAM preview, and there's a few things that we can make some adjustments on. The first thing is the opacity of the trail as it comes back towards camera. We're going to adjust that slightly. And the other thing is the rolling effect. I was going to adjust that, but I sort of like it. It sort of indicates that there's a bit of a vector roll happening with the exhaust plume from the missile. And if we introduce just a little bit of velocity to that, then we can sort of break that up just slightly. And so we'll go ahead and do that. We'll bring up the trails, particles, and we'll just isolate just the trails, and we're going to increase that velocity from the emitter. Bring the velocity random up to say 20, maybe even higher, 35, and we're going to increase the velocity to about 8. See how that looks, and that's not too bad. That's broken it up so that it's not quite so barrel in shape. And we'll come down to our particles, and we're going to set the opacity over life, and if we toggle down, we're going to drop the opacity down over life, and one of these preset graphs is fine. And I'm just going to bring the opacity down slightly on the overall effect, down to about 85 is fine. Opacity random, maybe 10%, and that looks fine. We'll just come through, and that's quite okay. We'll probably just reduce that rolling slightly, which is this rotation speed. I'm just going to bring it down to 0.3, and that's fine. So that's our missile trail done, and because we used a wiggle for the position of it, which I might just, it's moving just a little bit slow from the null position, so I'm just going to increase this to 0.6, and we'll go up to about 170, and that's just going to give us a little bit more movement of the missile, make it a little bit more dynamic. Now what we're going to do is duplicate that layer, and if we highlight the trails and hit Control D, we'll duplicate the layer, and it creates a second missile. And because we used a random, we're getting a little bit of transparency problem back here. I think it's going to be okay. Because we used a wiggle value, wiggle relies on the index value of the layer, and therefore those values change. If we duplicate, we don't get exactly the same position data. So that's fine. Let's bring up our whole comp, and what we're going to do is put a little bit of adjustment layer over the top. So if we create layer, new adjustment layer, and we'll drag that down to just above the trails, and what we're going to do, this is a bit of a trick to create slightly ethereal feel. If we right click, blur, fast blur, we're going to crank this up to about 20, and we're going to change the mode. We'll get rid of parent column there for a moment, don't need that, and bring up our transfer modes. We're going to use the screen transfer mode, and you'll see that it gives us a fairly ethereal, almost like a glow. I think what we'll do, judging by some of these stills, is we'll just adjust. We'll bring up the position value and we'll drop this one back to 150, and we'll drop its wiggle back to 0.5, and that way we're going to have a little bit of random movement that differs from the other trail. And I think what we'll do, I don't really like the transparency that's happening, so let's just bring up our particle and we'll set our opacity back to 100. And the opacity over life is fine to have that ramp off. We'll bring the same on the other one. We'll bring our opacity back to 100. And that should be fine. Now if I just isolate the background, you'll see that our camera movement actually takes the background element off at the top. And so we'll go into our horizon settings, and we're just going to do a little bit of a rotation on the x-axis. Just slide it back up and we'll come through. Now the same problems happened at the bottom, so an axis change is not going to help us. What we need to do is increase our vertical coverage and just slide it up. And there we have it. And that should be fine. So we'll switch up on our whole effect, and we're starting to get some nice movement here, some nice effects happening throughout the whole animation. We'll probably just on the clouds, we'll change the color slightly, darken it down just slightly. Just bring a little bit of value out of the clouds. Something like that. And that's looking pretty good. Now we'll also add a solid, new solid, and we'll call that vignette, and we'll leave it black, and with our mask tool, ellipse, we'll double click on it and we'll just bring that up. We're going to slide that down just above the adjustment layer, and if we click MM to bring up our mask, we're going to subtract the mask. We'll put a feather of about 200, and we'll change that to a classic color burn, and we'll drop the opacity of it by clicking T. We'll drop that down to about 40%. We might just bring up the mask settings again and bring that in slightly, something like that. And we're getting a little bit of clipping around the edge, and so I'm not too sure why that's happening. Well, it's definitely got something to do with the trails. Okay, so if we grab both of our trails and hit S for scale, we're going to increase the scale to 102. And that just clips off the edge. And the clouds will do the same. So just bring up scale and 102. Now if we have a look at our whole effect, it's looking pretty good. We'll give it a RAM preview and see where we are. Okay, back from that round preview, I did make one subtle change just on the BG element. I included a hue and saturation underneath the horizon effect and just dropped the master saturation down slightly and increased the lightness. The background was just looking a little bit dark. So there's our end effect. And there's a few other things that we could do to this. Motion blur would be a good idea. And in the example I showed you before we started, it did have some motion blur in it, and I would strongly suggest that you use a bit of motion blur on this effect. But that's the particular plugin with missile trails and the 3D clouds as well. We also use the Horizon plugin to allow the background to react to the camera in the correct way. And that's it for this tutorial. So until next time, bye for now.